Imagine standing in a room where the air is so thick with heat and flies that you can barely breathe. Outside, the world's most powerful empire is hunting you down. If you succeed, you change the course of human history. If you fail, your neck ends up in a British noose and your family is left in ruins. This isn't just a piece of parchment, it's a death warrant. This is the true story of how 13 fractured colonies decided to spit in the face of a king and gamble everything on a radical idea called liberty. Philadelphia, June 1776. The city is a pressure cooker. The Second Continental Congress is meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, but this isn't a polite debate, it's a shouting match. Outside, British warships are appearing off the coast of New York like a forest of masts. Inside, the delegates are terrified, exhausted, and divided. Many delegates still hope for peace. They see themselves as British subjects who have been wronged, not rebels. But one man, John Adams, a short, blunt-talking lawyer from Massachusetts, is losing his patience. He knows the time for talk is over. He needs a formal declaration to unite the colonies and, more importantly, to convince France and Spain that the Americans are serious enough to deserve military aid. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stands up and drops the bombshell. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The room goes silent. This is it. This is the point of no return. But Congress isn't ready to vote yet. They need a document, a manifesto, that explains why they are doing this to the rest of the world. They appoint a committee of 5 to write it. Among them is Benjamin Franklin, the genius scientist, and John Adams. But they don't want to write it. They turn to a tall, quiet 33-year-old Virginian with a reputation for being a brilliant writer but a terrible public speaker. His name is Thomas Jefferson. Locked away in a sweltering rented room on Market Street with only a small wooden desk and his thoughts, Jefferson begins to scratch out the words that will define the modern world. He isn't just writing divorce papers from England. He is trying to capture lightning in a bottle. The heat in Philadelphia isn't just weather, it's a physical weight. Thomas Jefferson, a man who loves the cool breezes of his mountain home at Monticello, is trapped in a rented second-floor room at Jacob Graff's brick house on Market Street. He's only 33 years old, young, lanky, and deeply homesick. He didn't even want this job. He wanted to be back in Virginia, helping write their state constitution. But fate and a very persistent John Adams had other plans. I am a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Besides, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. So Jefferson sits at a small, portable wooden desk, one he designed himself. He has no library, no internet, no team of researchers. He has a few pamphlets, his own previous drafts, and a mind saturated with the radical ideas of the Enlightenment. The ghost of John Locke. For days, the only sound in the room is the scratching of a quill pen and the buzzing of flies. Jefferson isn't trying to be original. He later said he was trying to provide an expression of the American mind. He reaches back to the English philosopher John Locke. Locke had argued that men had natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson stares at the word property. It feels too small, too cold. In a stroke of poetic genius, he crosses it out in his mind and replaces it with something more evocative, something that speaks to the human spirit, the pursuit of happiness. The secret edits. Once he has a rough draft, he doesn't take it to the full Congress, not yet. He takes it to the 2 men he trusts most, the elder statesman Benjamin Franklin and the firebrand John Adams. Imagine the scene. Franklin is sitting in an easy chair, nursing a painful case of the gout, peering through his bifocals at Jefferson's parchment. Jefferson is pacing, nervous as a schoolboy.
Franklin stops at a particular line. Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin, the scientist and man of reason, shakes his head. Sacred sounds too religious, too much like the divine right of the kings they are trying to escape. He picks up a pen and makes one of the most famous edits in history. He scratches out "sacred and undeniable" and replaces it with two words that ring like a bell: self-evident. It's a masterstroke. It implies that equality isn't just a religious belief, it's a scientific fact. It's common sense. The missing clause. But there is a dark shadow in the room. Jefferson, a man who owns over 100 human beings, writes a blistering 168-word paragraph attacking the king for the Atlantic slave trade. He calls it a cruel war against human nature itself. It is a moment of profound hypocrisy, but also a moment of radical vision. He is trying to bake the abolition of slavery into the very founding document of the nation. But as he looks at Adams and Franklin, he knows this section is a landmine. If they keep it in, the southern colonies will walk out. If they take it out, they leave a hole in the heart of their new liberty that will take a civil war to mend nearly a century later. Jefferson finished the draft. He was exhausted. He had turned a political grievance into a masterpiece of English prose. But the hardest part hasn't even started. Now he has to present this to the lions of Congress, men who will rip his beautiful words apart, word by word, in a room that is about to become a battlefield. On the morning of July 1st, the atmosphere in the Pennsylvania State House was suffocating. A massive thunderstorm was brewing outside, mirroring the tension inside the hall. Thomas Jefferson sat in the back of the room, his long legs cramped under a small desk. He had handed his fair copy to the President of the Congress, John Hancock. Now he had to do the one thing a writer hates most: sit in total silence while a committee of 50 men picked his soul apart. Before they could discuss Jefferson's words, they had to decide if they were actually going to rebel. This was the moment of truth. Pennsylvania and South Carolina were still hesitant. New York was abstaining because they hadn't received orders from home. John Adams stood up and delivered a speech so powerful, so electric, that one delegate called him the Atlas of Independence. He spoke for hours, arguing that the colonies were already at war. The blood had been spilled at Lexington and Concord, and to turn back now was to accept the life of a slave. Outside, the rain began to pour. Inside, the delegates were casting their votes. One by one, the noes turned into yeses. On July 2nd, the resolution passed. Technically, July 2nd is the day the colonies became independent, but the world wouldn't know why until they finished with Jefferson's paper. The mangling. For the next 2 days, the Congress turned into a pack of editors. Jefferson sat in the corner, his face flushing red, his knuckles white as he gripped his chair. He didn't say a word. He viewed every deleted sentence as a personal wound. They started at the top and worked their way down. They cut entire sections. They changed his passionate language into legal language. The most painful cut came toward the end. Jefferson's fierce condemnation of the slave trade, the paragraph where he accused King George III of violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty of an enslaved people, was met with a cold silence. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia stood firm. Remove it or there is no union. Even some northern merchants who made money from the shipping of enslaved people grew quiet. In a move that would haunt American history for generations, Congress struck the passage out. Jefferson watched as his attempt to address the original sin of the colonies was erased with a few strokes of a quill. By the late morning of July 4th, the document was shorter, leaner, and, though Jefferson hated to admit it, stronger. Congress had cut about 25% of his original text. They had removed his more emotional outbursts and replaced them with a steady, clinical list of grievances that read like a criminal indictment against the king. They were no longer just complaining. They were building a legal case for the existence of a new nation. As the heat rose and the horseflies from a nearby stable began to bite through the delegates' silk stockings, the final version was called for a vote. One by one, the colonies shouted aye. It was done. But as the room cleared, a heavy realization set in. They'd just signed their own death warrants. They weren't just politicians anymore. They were traitors to the British Crown. And the British Army, the most professional killing machine on the planet, was already landing in New York Harbor to collect their heads.
July 4th to August 2nd, 1776. The room did not erupt in cheers. There were no fireworks inside the hall, no popping of champagne corks. Instead, there was a hollow, ringing silence. The delegates knew that by approving this document, they had just stepped off a cliff. John Hancock, the president of the Congress, stepped forward. He was a wealthy man with everything to lose. He picked up the quill and scrawled his name in massive, flowing letters right in the center. Legend says he wrote it so large that King George could read it without his spectacles. It was a gesture of ultimate defiance, a middle finger to the monarchy. But for the rest of the men, the reality was sinking in. They weren't just founding fathers yet. They were fugitives. The printing and the flight. As soon as the document was approved, a man named John Dunlap stayed up all night in his printing shop. He worked by candlelight, the smell of fresh ink filling the air as he typeset the words, "In Congress, July 4th, 1776. By morning, copies, now known as the Dunlap broadsides, were being rushed by horseback to every colony, every army camp, and across the Atlantic to the king himself. When the Declaration reached George Washington's troops in New York, the soldiers were so electrified that they pulled down a massive lead statue of King George III and melted it into 42,000 bullets. They were literally going to shoot the king back at his own empire. The August signing, a brotherhood of death. While we celebrate July 4th, the actual famous parchment, the one we see in the National Archives today, wasn't signed until August 2nd. This was the day the official engrossed copy was ready. As the men lined up to sign, the mood was funeral dark. The British had just decimated the American forces at the Battle of Long Island. The Revolution looked like it was dying in the cradle. Benjamin Franklin, ever the wit, tried to break the tension with a grim truth. We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. Then there was Benjamin Harrison of Virginia. He looked at the tiny, frail Elbridge Gerry and joked, "I shall have a great advantage over you, Mr. Gerry, when we are all hung for this. With my weight, I will die in minutes. You shall be kicking in the air for half an hour." It was gallows humor in its literal sense. The high cost of a signature. These men weren't just signing a piece of paper, they were putting a target on their backs, and the British did not forget. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was captured, dragged from his bed, and thrown into a brutal military prison where he was starved and frozen. He never recovered his health. Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia, during the siege of Yorktown, urged George Washington to fire cannons at his own home because British officers were using it as a headquarters. He died in poverty after using his personal wealth to fund the war. Francis Lewis had his home destroyed and his wife captured and brutally mistreated by the British. She died shortly after her release. 12 signers had their homes burned to the ground. 17 lost everything they owned. 5 were captured and tortured. They gave up their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor so that the words on that parchment could mean something. The Declaration of Independence was now out in the world. It was no longer Jefferson's poem or Congress's legal brief. It was a living, breathing entity that was about to go to war.
1879 to the present day. The parchment signed in Philadelphia was more than a local divorce from a king. It was a psychological earthquake. In 1776, the world was a map of empires and subjects. The idea that all men are created equal was laughed at in the royal courts of Europe. But as the ink dried, that radical idea began to travel. It became a contagion of liberty that no ocean could contain. The French explosion. The first place the spark landed was France. The French had spent a fortune helping the Americans win their war, leaving their own country bankrupt and starving. When French soldiers, like the young Marquis de Lafayette, returned home, they didn't just bring stories of battle, they brought the spirit of '76. In 1789, when the French people rose up against King Louis XVI, they didn't just grab pitchforks, they grabbed pens. They wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Its DNA was purely Jeffersonian. The world watched in shock as the most powerful monarchy in Europe collapsed under the weight of the same words that had started in a sweltering room in Philadelphia. A global chain reaction. But the fire didn't stop in Paris. It raced across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and South America. Haiti, 1991. Enslaved people took the Declaration's promise of equality to its most literal and revolutionary conclusion, overthrowing their masters and creating the first free black republic. Latin America, 1810s. Revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar carried copies of the U.S. Declaration in their pockets as they fought to liberate Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru from Spanish rule. Vietnam, 1945. Over 150 years later, halfway across the globe, a leader named Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd in Hanoi. He began his own nation's Declaration of Independence by quoting Jefferson word for word. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The living document. The most incredible thing about the Declaration is that it has never truly finished its work. In 1776, it was a promissory note that the founders themselves hadn't fully paid. Jefferson owned slaves. Women couldn't vote. Native Americans were pushed off their lands. But the words were more powerful than the men who wrote them. They became a weapon for the oppressed. Abraham Lincoln called the Declaration the moral standard of the nation, using it to argue for the end of slavery during the Civil War. Elizabeth Stanton used its format at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to demand rights for women, writing, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and called the Declaration a check that had come back marked insufficient funds, demanding that America finally live up to its creed. Conclusion: the eternal flame. Today, that original parchment sits in a bulletproof titanium-framed case filled with inert argon gas in the National Archives. It is guarded day and night. But its true power isn't in the physical ink or the animal skin it's written on. Its power is in the fact that every time a human being somewhere on Earth stands up to a tyrant or demands to be treated with dignity, they are speaking the language of Philadelphia, 1776. It is the birth certificate of the modern world, a reminder that power does not come from the divine right of kings, but from the consent of the governed.
The Deep Dive. Behind the scenes of 1776. To understand why the Declaration was so revolutionary, we have to look past the ink in the parchment. We have to look at the clandestine war of nerves that was happening in the streets of Philadelphia and the halls of London. This wasn't just a debate. It was a high-stakes chess match where the pieces were human lives. The British Intelligence Network. While Jefferson was writing, the city of Philadelphia was crawling with loyalists and British spies. King George III had a network of informants who were reporting back every move the Congress made. The delegates couldn't even go to a tavern for a drink without wondering if the person at the next table was a British agent. There was a constant fear that the British Navy would sail up the Delaware River and level the city before the document could even be finished. The pressure on the Committee of Five was immense. They weren't just writing in a vacuum, they were writing while looking over their shoulders. The radicalization of the common man. While the Founding Fathers were the ones in the room, the real push for independence came from the streets. In early 1766, a man named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was written in plain English, not the fancy legal language of the elites. It sold over 150,000 copies in a time when many people couldn't even read. It was read aloud in taverns, in army camps, and on street corners. Paine's words acted like gasoline on a fire. He argued that the idea of a king was absurd and that a small island, England, had no business ruling a whole continent. This bottom-up pressure forced the hands of the wealthy delegates in Congress. They realized that if they didn't declare independence, the people might just do it without them. The silent delegates, the women of 1776. History books often forget that while the men were debating, the women were the ones keeping the colonies alive. Abigail Adams wrote famous letters to her husband John, warning him, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." She wasn't just asking for a favor, she was pointing out a massive flaw in their equality argument. While the men were in Philadelphia, women like Abigail were managing farms, surviving smallpox outbreaks, and hiding rebel supplies from British soldiers. Without their logistics and support, the men in that room would have run out of resources within months. The king's response, the proclamation of rebellion. Across the ocean, King George III wasn't sitting idle. Even before the declaration reached him, he had issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. He declared the American leaders to be dangerous and ill-designing men who had forgotten the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and supported them. This was the ultimate insult. The king viewed the Americans as ungrateful children. This psychological divide is what made the Declaration so fierce. Jefferson wasn't just listing taxes, he was responding to the king's claim that Americans were inferior. The economic gamble. The Declaration was also a massive economic risk. The colonies were deeply tied to the British economy. By declaring independence, they were essentially cutting off their own blood supply. Merchants in the North knew their ships would be seized. Planters in the South knew their tobacco markets would vanish. When you read the words, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes," the word fortunes wasn't a metaphor. These were some of the richest men in America, and they were choosing to become bankrupt outcasts for the sake of an idea. The aftermath, the long road to recognition. The Declaration didn't make America free, it only gave them a reason to fight. The war would drag on for 7 more brutal years. There were times like the winter at Valley Forge when it seemed the Declaration was nothing more than a scrap of paper blowing in the wind. But every time a soldier was ready to quit, they remembered those words. They weren't fighting for a king anymore, they were fighting for themselves. The Declaration had shifted the moral high ground. It made the British look like invaders and the Americans look like defenders of universal human rights. While the delegates in Philadelphia were celebrating their defiance, the Declaration of Independence was making its way across the Atlantic. It took weeks for the document to reach London, carried by fast-sailing merchant ships. When it finally landed on the desks of British officials, it didn't inspire awe, it inspired fury. The king's cold silence. King George III was at his summer residence when the news arrived. To the British monarchy, the Declaration wasn't a noble statement of rights, it was a scurrilous and insolent pamphlet. The king refused to even acknowledge the colonies as a separate nation. In his mind, George Washington was not a general, he was a criminal leader of a street gang. On October 31, 1776, the king addressed Parliament. He spoke of the unhappy and deluded people of the colonies. He claimed that the American leaders had rejected with insult his offers of reconciliation and now were aiming for a total independence. He promised to use every resource of the British Empire, the greatest navy on earth, and thousands of Hessian mercenaries to crush this rebellious spirit. The answer to the Declaration. The British government didn't just ignore the document. They hired a professional writer, John Lind, to write a 137-page rebuttal called An Answer to the Declaration of the American Congress. Lind attacked Jefferson's logic with surgical precision. He mocked the idea that all men are created equal. He pointed out the glaring hypocrisy. How can these Americans talk about liberty when they hold thousands of black people in slavery? It was a powerful argument that wounded the American cause in the eyes of many Europeans. Lind argued that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were vague, meaningless words used to justify a simple tax revolt. The trial of public opinion. London was divided. Not everyone hated the Americans. In the coffee houses of London, radical thinkers and some members of Parliament like Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox warned that the Ting was making a mistake. They argued that by treating the Americans like slaves, the king was forcing them to become rebels. But the majority of the British public was offended. To them, the Americans were children of the Empire, who had been protected by British blood and money during the French and Indian War. To see them betray the mother country was seen as the ultimate act of ingratitude. The logistics of a global war. The Declaration changed the British military strategy overnight. Before July 1766, the British thought they were just putting down a few riots in Boston. After July 4th, they realized they were in a full-scale war for an entire continent. The British Admiralty began the largest overseas expedition in history until World War I. They sent 32,000 troops, 400 ships, and 73 warships to New York. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to wipe the United States off the map before the ink on the Declaration could even be dry. The secret warning. Back in Philadelphia, a secret message arrived for the Congress from a sympathizer in London. The message was simple. The king is coming. He is not coming to arrest you. He is coming to destroy you. The stakes had shifted. The Declaration had turned a political argument into a survival struggle. The delegates realized that their parchment would only stay real if they could find a way to beat the most powerful military force in human history.
By the end of 1776, the bold ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, but the revolution was already on the verge of total collapse. The British super army had landed in New York and smashed through Washington's lines. The American army was in a frantic, bloody retreat across New Jersey. The Declaration, once a symbol of hope, was now a heavy burden. If the British captured it, they wouldn't just burn it, they would use it as a list of names for the gallows. The Great Escape. As the British moved closer to Philadelphia, panic gripped the city. The Continental Congress, once a place of fiery debate, became a scene of chaotic evacuation. The delegates packed their belongings into wagons and fled to Baltimore. The official parchment was rolled up, stuffed into a linen bag, and thrown into a rough wooden chest. It traveled in a bumpy ox cart, rattling over frozen mud roads, hidden under piles of ordinary luggage. The birth certificate of America was being smuggled like contraband. For months, the document was moved from house to house, basement to basement, always one step ahead of British cavalry patrols. The desertion crisis. Outside, the situation was even worse. Washington's army had shrunk from 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000. They were barefoot, starving, and leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Most of the soldiers' enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. The king's generals were so confident of victory that they began offering pardons to anyone who would sign a statement of loyalty to the crown. Thousands of people took the offer. People began to mock the declaration. They called it a piece of paper with no power. The dream of 1776 was freezing to death in the woods of Pennsylvania. The crisis and the turning point. At this moment, Thomas Paine, the man who wrote Common Sense, grabbed a drumhead to use as a desk and wrote a new pamphlet by the light of a campfire. He titled it The American Crisis. He wrote the famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country." Washington ordered these words to be read to every shivering regiment in his army. It reminded the men why they had signed that paper in July. It wasn't about taxes, it was about the fundamental right to be free. The Christmas miracle. On the night of December 25th, 1776, Washington took the ultimate gamble. He led his freezing troops across the ice-choked Delaware River. It was a suicide mission, but the spirit of the Declaration gave them a strange, desperate strength. They surprised the Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. It was a stunning victory. A few days later, they won again at Princeton. Suddenly, the piece of paper in the ox cart had teeth again. The Revolution wasn't dead. The Declaration had survived its first winter, proving that an idea, if backed by enough courage, could withstand the might of an empire. The hidden toll. While the American soldiers were bleeding in the snow of New Jersey, the fate of the Declaration of Independence was actually being decided in the lavish, gold-leafed halls of Versailles, France. The Continental Congress knew a hard truth. They could not win this war alone. They had the words, but they didn't have the gunpowder. They had the spirit, but they didn't have a navy. They needed a superpower ally, and there was only one country with a grudge big enough against England to help: France. The architect of deception. Benjamin Franklin. In late 1776, the Congress sent their most brilliant mind, the 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin, to Paris. His mission was simple, but incredibly dangerous. Use the Declaration of Independence to convince King Louis XVI, an absolute monarch, to help a democratic revolution. Think about the irony. Franklin was asking a king who believed he was chosen by God to help a group of rebels who were claiming that all men are created equal. The spy capital. Paris was a nest of vipers. Every move Franklin made was watched by British spies. His own secretary, Edward Bancroft, was actually a double agent on the British payroll, reporting Franklin's secret meetings back to London within hours. Franklin knew he was being watched. Instead of hiding, he played a character. He wore a simple fur hat and plain brown clothes, looking like a rugged philosopher of the woods. The French public fell in love with him. He became a superstar. He used the Declaration as a marketing tool, printing copies in French and distributing them to the elite. He made liberty the most fashionable idea in Paris. The document as a contract. To the French government, the Declaration of Independence was more than a statement of rights. It was a legal guarantee. The French were hesitant to help because they feared the Americans would eventually make peace with England and leave France to fight alone. The Declaration was Franklin's proof. He pointed to the text and said, "Look, we have publicly insulted the king. We have called him a tyrant. There is no turning back for us. We are in this until the end."
The document was the collateral that proved the Americans were serious. The victory at Saratoga. For a year, the French wavered. He sent secret shipments of arms and money, but he wouldn't commit his army. He was waiting for a sign that the Americans could actually win a real battle. That sign came in October 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. The Americans defeated and captured an entire British army. When the news reached Paris, Franklin pounced. He told the French that if they didn't join the war now, the Americans might be forced to reconcile with England. The Treaty of Alliance. On February 6, 1778, the miracle happened. France officially recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. They signed a Treaty of Alliance. Now, it wasn't just farmers with muskets against the British Empire. It was the French Navy, French gold, and French professional soldiers joining the fight. The Declaration of Independence had successfully internationalized the war. It was no longer a colonial rebellion, it was a world war. The British were now terrified. They had to pull troops out of America to defend their own shores and their colonies in the Caribbean. The Declaration, which started as a desperate cry for help, had brought the world's second greatest empire into the fight to destroy the first.
The Declaration of Independence had survived 5 years of fire, retreat, and cold. But by 1781, the American people were exhausted. The economy was in ruins, and the British had moved their focus to the southern colonies, burning plantations and capturing cities. The self-evident truths were under their greatest threat yet. But then the stars aligned. The words of the parchment were about to be backed by the weight of heavy iron. The trap is set. British General Cornwallis had moved his army to a small tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. He thought he was safe because he was on a peninsula, expecting the British Navy to protect him from the sea. He was wrong. In a move of brilliant military coordination, George Washington's army marched hundreds of miles from the north, while a massive French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed up from the Caribbean. For the first time in the war, the British were the ones trapped. They were surrounded by 17,000 American and French troops on land and blocked by 24 French warships at sea. The roar of the Declaration. The siege was brutal. For weeks, the ground shook as French and American cannons pounded the British defenses. Imagine the scene. Thomas Jefferson was just a few miles away at his home in Virginia, while the very empire he had defied was being systematically dismantled by the force of his ideas and French gunpowder. On the night of October 14th, a young Alexander Hamilton led a bayonet charge against a British redoubt, a fort. They didn't even load their guns. They wanted to move in total silence and strike with cold steel. They took the fort in minutes. The British realized then that the rabble they had mocked in 1776 had become a professional, deadly army. The surrender. On October 19, 1781, the white flag went up. General Cornwallis, too humiliated to show his face, sent his second-in-command to surrender. As the British soldiers marched out to lay down their muskets, their band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was a literal truth. A group of 13 ragged colonies had defeated the most powerful empire on the planet. The Declaration of Independence was no longer a list of complaints or a dream. It was now the law of the land. Winning the war was only the beginning. The physical document, the piece of animal skin signed by the 56 men, now began a journey of its own that would last centuries. The Treaty of Paris, 1883. It took 2 years of intense negotiation in Paris to finalize the peace. Great Britain finally signed a treaty recognizing the United States as free, sovereign, and independent. When the news reached America, the original declaration was finally brought out of hiding. It was no longer a death warrant, it was a birth certificate.
The invisible enemy, time. For the next century, the document faced a new enemy, neglect. It was moved from city to city as the capital changed, from New York to Philadelphia, and finally to the new city of Washington, D.C. In the 1900s, people didn't understand how to preserve old paper. They hung it in public buildings near open windows. Tobacco smoke, coal dust, and direct sunlight hit the parchment every day. The ink began to flake off. The bold signatures of men like John Hancock and Samuel Adams started to fade into the yellowed background. The Civil War close call. In 1861, as the American Civil War broke out, the Declaration was once again in danger. Confederate troops were just across the Potomac River. The document was hurriedly moved to a secure vault. Lincoln, who looked to the Declaration as his political chart and compass, made sure it was protected. He believed that the Union's only purpose was to fulfill the promise made in 1776, that all men were created equal. The final vault, 1952. It wasn't until after World War II that the United States realized their most precious document was dying. In 1952, a massive armored motorcade, escorted by tanks and soldiers, carried the Declaration of Independence to its final home, the National Archives. They placed it in a specially designed shrine. It was sealed in a glass case filled with argon gas to prevent oxygen from rotting it. Every night, the document is lowered by a massive elevator into a reinforced bomb-proof vault deep underground. The 19th century to the modern era. The Declaration of Independence did not die with the men who signed it, nor did it stop at the borders of the United States. It became a ghost in the machine of global politics, a set of words that would eventually haunt every dictator, king, and oppressor on the planet. For over 200 years, whenever people have felt the heavy boot of tyranny on their necks, they have reached for Thomas Jefferson's quill. The export of revolution. As the 19th century dawned, the Declaration of Independence became America's most dangerous export. In Latin America, revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar, the liberator, and José de San Martín studied the American text with religious devotion. They saw that if a group of colonies in the north could defeat the British, they could defeat the Spanish Empire in the south. In 1808 to 1826, almost all of Latin America rose up. They didn't just fight for land, they fought for the rights of man described in Philadelphia. The irony of 1848 Seneca Falls. Back in America, the document was being used to challenge the very men who wrote it. In 1848, a group of brave women gathered in a small chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. They were tired of being second-class citizens in a free country. Elizabeth Cady Stanton stood up and read a document she had written called the Declaration of Sentiments. She kept the structure of Jefferson's 1776 text exactly the same, but she added two life-changing words. She wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." It was a political masterstroke. By using the founders' own language, she made it impossible for them to argue against her without sounding like the very king they had overthrown. The Civil War, the rebirth of the idea. By 1860, the United States was tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery, the missing clause that Jefferson had been forced to delete. Lincoln understood that the Constitution was just the frame, but the Declaration of Independence was the apple of gold inside it. During the bloody Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln didn't talk about taxes or states' rights. He went back to 1776. He said the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. With those words, he redefined the Declaration. It was no longer just a document about independence from England. It was a promise that America had to keep to all its people, regardless of their race. The 20th century, from Vietnam to the Berlin Wall. The echo traveled even further as technology brought the world closer. In 1945, in a shocking twist of history, Ho Chi Minh stood in a square in Hanoi to declare Vietnam's independence from French colonial rule. He began his speech by quoting the American Declaration word for word. He hoped that by using Jefferson's words, the United States would support his cause. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall crumbled and students stood in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square, they weren't just shouting for food or money. They were shouting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They even built a goddess of democracy statue that looked remarkably like the Statue of Liberty, the torch-bearing symbol inspired by the 1776 spirit. The Declaration in the digital age. Today, in the year 2025, the Declaration of Independence is more relevant than ever. We live in an era where data privacy, artificial intelligence, and global surveillance challenge our inalienable rights in ways Jefferson could never have imagined. But the core question of the Declaration remains: who owns you? Do you belong to a state, a corporation, or a king? Or do you own yourself? The 56 signers of 1776 didn't have the answers to all of history's problems. They were flawed, complicated, and in many ways hypocritical men. But they did something no one else had dared to do. They wrote down a standard of human dignity that is so high the world is still trying to reach it. The final cinematic vision. Imagine that original parchment today, resting in its vacuum-sealed vault. The ink is faded, the signatures are ghosts, and the skin is wrinkled. But if you listen closely to the pages of history, those words are still screaming. They scream in the hearts of protesters in distant lands. They scream in every courtroom where justice is sought. And they scream every time a single individual stands up and says no to an unjust power. The Declaration of Independence wasn't the end of a story. It was the big bang of the modern world, and the explosion is still happening.
Chapter 15. The Final Legacy. The Unfinished Revolution. The Present and the Future. We have traveled through the sweltering heat of the Philadelphia State House, the frozen banks of the Delaware River, the smoke of Yorktown, and the grand halls of Versailles. But the story of the Declaration of Independence doesn't end in a museum. It ends and begins again with us. The paradox of the founders. To truly tell this story for a modern audience, we must look at the founding fathers not as marble statues, but as men on a tightrope. They were visionaries who dreamed of a world of equality, yet many of them went home to plantations worked by enslaved people. This is the great American paradox. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," Thomas Jefferson, was a man who struggled with that truth every day of his life. But here is the secret. The words were better than the men. The ideals they put on paper were so powerful that they eventually broke the very systems of oppression that the founders themselves lived in. The Declaration was a time bomb set in the foundation of tyranny, and it has been exploding ever since. The consent of the governed. The most radical phrase in the entire document isn't life or liberty. It is the consent of the governed. Before 1776, the world believed power flowed from the top down. The king was the sun, and the people were just dust in his light. The Declaration flipped the universe upside down. It said that the people are the sun, and the government is just a tool, a servant that only exists as long as the people allow it to. This idea is the software that runs every democracy on Earth today. Whenever you vote, whenever you protest, whenever you demand better from your leaders, you are acting out the script written in 1776. The guardian of the rights.
There is a reason why even in 2025, millions of people travel from all over the world to wait in long lines at the National Archives. They don't come to see a pretty document. It's actually quite damaged and hard to read. They come to stand in the presence of an idea. They come to see the physical proof that a small group of people, armed with nothing but sacred honor and a brilliant argument, successfully challenged the greatest empire in history. It gives people hope that no matter how dark the times get, self-evident truths cannot be permanently buried. The final cinematic closing. Script for your video. Imagine a slow zoom on the faded signature of John Hancock as the music builds to a crescendo. In the summer of 1776, 56 men stepped into the shadows of a gallows. They weren't soldiers, they were lawyers, doctors, farmers, and merchants. They had everything to lose: their wealth, their families, and their lives. They didn't just write a letter to a king, they issued a challenge to the future. They dared to imagine a world where you are not a subject, but a citizen, where your rights don't come from a government, but from the simple fact that you breathe. The ink has faded, the men are long dead, but the Declaration is not a relic of the past. It is a living, breathing mission statement. It is a reminder that liberty is not a gift, it is a responsibility. The revolution didn't end at Yorktown. It continues every time we speak truth to power. It continues every time we demand justice. It continues with you. Because as long as there is one person on earth who is not free, the Declaration of Independence is still being written. The anatomy of the document. We often focus on the beautiful preamble, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But the vast majority of the Declaration of Independence is actually a cold, hard, and brutal list of criminal charges. To a U.S. audience, this is the courtroom drama of the story. Jefferson didn't just say the king was bad. He acted as a prosecutor, laying out 27 specific grievances that proved that George III was a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. The he who broke the law. If you read the Declaration, you'll notice a rhythmic, pounding repetition. He has refused, he has forbidden, he has plundered. This was intentional. By focusing on the he, the king, Jefferson was stripping away the mystical protection of the crown. He was humanizing the enemy so they could destroy him. 1. The judicial stranglehold. One of the most detailed sections of the story is how the king destroyed the legal system in the colonies. He didn't just raise taxes, he made judges dependent on his will alone for their salaries. Imagine a court where the judge is paid by your opponent. That was the reality in 1776. Jefferson argued that when the law is a puppet of the leader, there is no such thing as a free man. 2. The mock trials and the murderers. This is the part of the story that really riled up the American people. Jefferson accused the king of protecting British soldiers who committed crimes against colonists. After the Boston Massacre, the British government passed the Administration of Justice Act. The colonists called it the Murder Act. It allowed British officials who killed Americans to be tried back in England, where they were almost always set free. To the Americans, this was a license to kill. The Declaration made it clear the king had placed his soldiers' lives above the lives of his subjects. The economic chokehold. More than just tea. Everyone knows about the tea tax, but the Declaration reveals a much deeper economic war. The king had cut off the colony's trade with all parts of the world. This was a move to keep the Americans poor and dependent. He was essentially trying to starve the colonies into submission. Furthermore, Jefferson pointed out that the king was taxing them without our consent.
In the 18th century, property was seen as an extension of the self. If the government could take your money without your vote, they essentially owned you. It was a battle for the soul of the individual's labor. 4. The mercenary shadow, the Hessians. Perhaps the most terrifying part of the Declaration is the mention of the Hessians. The king had hired thousands of German professional killers, mercenaries, to cross the Atlantic and subdue the colonies. Jefferson wrote, "He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny." This was a turning point for many Americans who were still on the fence. It was one thing for your mother country to send British soldiers. It was another thing for the king to hire foreign butchers to kill his own people. It was the ultimate betrayal of the father-son relationship between the king and the colonies. The insurrection and the merciless savages. In a very controversial and dark section of the document, Jefferson accused the king of inciting domestic insurrections. He was referring to two things: the British offering freedom to enslaved people if they ran away and fought for the king, and encouraging Native American tribes to attack frontier settlements. This shows the desperation and the complexity of the time. The founders were fighting for their freedom, but they were also terrified of the people they were holding down. This section of the Declaration is a raw look at the fear that gripped the colonies, a fear of a total societal collapse triggered by the king. The conclusion of the prosecution. Jefferson ended this list not with a plea for mercy, but with a statement of fact. He argued that the Americans had tried to petition the king multiple times. They had been humble, they had been patient, but a prince whose character is thus marked by every act that may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. The list of 27 grievances was the nail in the coffin. It turned a philosophical argument into a legal necessity. It wasn't just that the Americans wanted to be free, it was that the king had already broken the contract. He was no longer their king, he was a common criminal.
In the American imagination, the signers of the Declaration are often seen as wealthy, comfortable men who lived long, happy lives after their moment of glory. But the reality is much more brutal. When they dipped their quills into the inkwells in August 1776, they weren't just signing a document, they were signing away their safety, their wealth, and for some, their families. The British Empire viewed these 56 men as the high priests of treason. There were no prisoner of war protections for them. If caught, they faced the terrible death of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The man who lost everything, Richard Stockton. Richard Stockton was a wealthy judge from New Jersey. He had a beautiful estate and a massive library. After signing the Declaration, he was captured by local loyalists and handed over to the British. They didn't treat him like a gentleman. They threw him into a freezing, filthy cell in New York's Provost Jail. He was starved and denied warm clothing during a brutal winter. While he was in prison, British soldiers occupied his home, burned his library, and drove his family into hiding. By the time Stockton was released in a prisoner exchange, his health was shattered. He died a broken, impoverished man before the war even ended. He gave his life for a country he never got to see flourish. The general who shelled his own home, Thomas Nelson, Jr. Thomas Nelson, Jr. was a wealthy Virginian who was serving as a general in the Continental Army. During the final battle at Yorktown, he looked through his spyglass and saw that his own magnificent home was being used as a headquarters by British officers. The American artillerymen were hesitant to fire on the home of one of their own leaders. Nelson didn't hesitate. He walked over to a cannon, pointed it at his own front door, and ordered the gunners to fire. He offered a reward to the first man who could hit his house. He watched his own property be reduced to rubble to ensure the British had nowhere to hide. He died bankrupt, having used his entire personal fortune to pay for the food and clothes of his soldiers. The tragedy of Francis Lewis. Francis Lewis was a delegate from New York. Because he signed the Declaration, the British targeted his home in Long Island. They leveled his house to the ground and took his wife, Elizabeth, prisoner. In an era where civilized warfare supposedly protected women, the British treated her with calculated cruelty. She was held in a crowded, unheated room without a bed or a change of clothes for months. By the time George Washington personally arranged for her release in exchange for British captives, the damage was done. Her health never recovered, and she died shortly after. Francis Lewis lost the love of his life because he dared to dream of a republic. The signers on the run. John Hart of New Jersey was forced to flee from his wife's bedside as she lay dying. Their 13 children fled in different directions. For more than a year, Hart lived in the woods and in caves, hunted like an animal by British patrols. When he finally returned home after the British retreated, his wife was dead, his children were gone, and his farm was a wasteland. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy trader, saw his entire fleet of ships captured by the British Navy. He lost his massive estates to pay off his debts and died in a small rented room. Thomas Hayward, Jr., Edward Rutledge, and Arthur Middleton, 3 of the youngest signers from South Carolina, were all captured during the fall of Charleston. They were shipped to a prison in St. Augustine, Florida, where they were kept in isolation for a year. Why did they do it? To the U.S. audience, this is the most powerful part of the story. These weren't professional revolutionaries with nothing to lose. These were the 1% of their time, the doctors, the lawyers, the plantation owners. They had everything to lose and only an idea to gain. When they reached the end of the Declaration and wrote the words, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor," it wasn't a poetic flourish. It was a literal statement of the stakes. They knew that if the revolution failed, their names would be remembered only as criminals. By risking everything, they ensured that the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness would be more than just ink on a page. They would be the foundation of a new world. July 1776, The Secret Descent. We often imagine that every American was a patriot and every delegate in Philadelphia was a hero. But the truth is that history is never that simple. The truth is that the Continental Congress was a room filled with fear, doubt, and massive internal conflict. For every man who was ready to sign the Declaration, there was another who thought it was a suicide pact or a tragic mistake. To understand the courage of the signers, you have to understand the arguments of the men who tried to stop them. The Great Dissenter, John Dickinson. If Thomas Jefferson was the pen of the Revolution and John Adams was the voice of the Revolution, then John Dickinson was the conscience of the opposition. Dickinson was one of the most respected men in America. He had written some of the most famous pamphlets against British taxes years earlier. But when it came time to declare independence, Dickinson stood up and gave a speech that chilled the room. He called the Declaration a brave but desperate act. He argued that the colonies were like a skiff made of paper trying to survive a hurricane. He warned that without a strong central government and a confirmed alliance with France, they were simply signing their own death warrants and leading the American people to the slaughter. On July 2nd, when the vote for independence was taken, Dickinson couldn't bring himself to vote yes, but he also didn't want to stand in the way of a united front. In a move of incredible personal integrity, he simply stayed home. By not showing up, he allowed the Pennsylvania delegation to vote in favor of independence. He sacrificed his political career for his principles. The Hidden Loyalists.
It wasn't just Dickinson. About a fifth of the American population remained loyalists, people who believed that King George III was their rightful ruler. In Philadelphia, families were torn apart. The most famous example, Benjamin Franklin. While he was in the room helping Jefferson edit the Declaration, his own son, William Franklin, was the royal governor of New Jersey and a staunch loyalist. The father and son never reconciled. Benjamin Franklin eventually had his son arrested and imprisoned. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just a war against England, it was a civil war that broke the hearts of families across the colonies. The missing names. There were men who were in the room during the debates but whose names never appeared on the parchment. Some, like Robert Livingston, one of the original Committee of Five, believed the timing was too early and refused to sign. Others were replaced by their state legislatures because they weren't as radical enough. There was also the strange case of Thomas McCain. He voted for independence on July 4th, then immediately left to lead a battalion into battle. Because he was off fighting, he didn't actually sign the parchment until years later, possibly as late as 1781. For years, the official printed copies of the Declaration didn't even have his name on them. He was a founding father who was too busy winning the war to sign the paper that started it. The silent majority of no's. We must remember that many delegates signed the document with trembling hands. They weren't all firebrands like Adams. Many were moderate men who felt they had been backed into a corner by the king's stubbornness. They signed not because they wanted a war, but because they felt they had no other choice. They were reluctant revolutionaries. Why this matters. To a U.S. audience, this chapter adds a layer of realism. It shows that democracy isn't about everyone agreeing. It's about the struggle to find a path forward when everyone is terrified. The Declaration didn't happen because everyone was brave. It happened because, despite their terror and their disagreements, they chose to move forward together. John Dickinson, the man who refused to sign, eventually picked up a musket and fought as a private in the militia to defend the very independence he had voted against. He proved that you can disagree with a policy, but still be loyal to your country.
For 38 years, the Declaration of Independence was treated like a sacred relic of a finished war. It sat in the city of Washington, D.C., a quiet symbol of a young nation's birth. But in the summer of 1814, the British returned. The War of 1812 was at its peak, and a massive British fleet had landed in Maryland, marching directly for the heart of the American government. This is the story of the day the American Revolution almost became a footnote in history, saved by a single clerk and a linen bag. The panic in the capital. As British troops crushed the American militia at Bladensburg, the citizens of Washington began to flee in terror. President James Madison was away at the front lines. The streets were filled with wagons and screaming families. Inside the State Department, most officials were busy saving their own skins. But one man, a clerk named Stephen Pleasanton, stood his ground. He looked at the walls of his office and saw the original Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and George Washington's secret correspondence. He knew that if the British captured these papers, they wouldn't just be trophies, they would be burned to signify the death of the American experiment. The scramble for linen. Pleasanton desperately asked for help to move the documents. His superiors told him to focus on other things, but he ignored them. He went out into the panic-stricken streets and brought a large quantity of coarse linen. He and a few assistants frantically stuffed the world-changing parchments into the bags. Just as the smoke from the approaching British army began to darken the horizon, Pleasanton loaded the bags into a humble, rickety farm wagon. He didn't have a military escort. He didn't have a secret vault. He had an ox cart and a dream. A night of fire. As Pleasanton drove the wagon out of the city, he looked back. The British had arrived. They set fire to the Capitol building and the White House,